as a little brief intro.
Okay.
Oh, thanks, Alex. So I'm going to, this is Liz Stockenborg with Marion Audubon. I'm introducing David Simpson, who's going to be speaking to us about how to ID gulls and shorebirds, or how do you know what you're looking at. So just as a brief introduction, David is a Florida premier birder. He is an eBird lister, which I love eBird and it's awesome. He holds ABA records in the Florida Big Year. In the Florida Life List, he's fourth. He's second in the Big Year. And he has at least 150 birds in 67 Florida counties. That's amazing. He's an environmental consultant. He's a past state park ranger. If you go to any of the local birding festivals around the state of Florida, including Space Coast, Birding and Wildlife, Festival of the Keys, our local one here in North Shore Birding and more, he is going to be a guide at one of them. So he has a mission to help birders learn the amazing advantages of becoming an eBird lister. And he works with his wife, Dee, to help develop local birding trips, promote ethical birding, and environmental education. So he does private birding guide, he does private guiding throughout the state of Florida, including the dry tortugas. And I have listed his website on our meetup page and his contact information. So hopefully you guys will contact him if you want a great guide to take you around. Welcome, David. I'm very excited to have you
All right.
talking to us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One note about the birds in Ohio, they have the biggest week in American birding up there in early May. It's a festival that if you really want to see the migration phenomenon up there, it's, shorebirds, ducks, songbirds, even blue jays are migrating up through there. So it's really an amazing experience to go up there. It's on the south shore of Lake Erie. So and I will be up there for about a week of the biggest week, guiding up there too. So anyways, so enough about other festivals and stuff. I'm gonna I've put together a list of species that we may see on our Saturday trip. I wanted to kind of focus on some of the species that we might see because when I do presentations with the field trip follow-up, I like to be able to follow up on what we actually talked about. So I've got several slides. I think I can get through them all um, in the next couple hours or so. We'll leave a little bit of time for questions, of course, at the end. If you guys have questions, you can put them in the chat, I believe, and we will review them and go over at the end. Basically, I'm going to tell you a bit about my experience with some of these species, the things that help me to identify them. They're all my photographs, so I'll apologize in advance for that. They're not the prettiest things, but they do get the job done at least. So without further ado, we'll get into it, into the coastal shorebirds. Um, well, let's see. Maybe not. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Whoops. Okay. So black skimmers are one. Some of these pictures I actually marked up for another class, so we'll have a lot more notes on some of them out there. But black skimmers are one of the things they seem to like the inlets. They do show up in inland areas like the St. Johns River floodplain and other places like that, but they're particularly good right around inlets, and they have this very strange look. They're almost kind of like parrot-like with their brightly colored bills and they're kind of oddly black. Most of the shorebirds and gulls and all that are mostly grays and whites and all that. These guys are kind of black on the back, um, and white underneath, of course. The bright orange legs most of the year, and that really severe underbite. It's really interesting to see. And I didn't include a picture of it. They do this really odd behavior sometimes where they just sit down on the ground with their bills stretched straight out forward. It almost looks like they've kind of, dropped dead there. The first time my wife saw that, she thought maybe it was something was wrong with them, but that's just something that they do. I don't know why. I don't know if any of us know why they do that, but it's just kind of a really weird behavior that they do. Skimmers, like least terns, will sometimes nest on gravel rooftops. They're a little bit less successful, I think, than the least terns are, but they are a they are a tern, but they're kind of a distant relative of terns. kind of in the same way that caracaras are falcons, but they're kind of way out there from the other members of their family. These are younger birds here with a little bit of brown on the back and the caps on them. As adults, they look more like this with the black. This was one by itself, which is a little bit unusual. Black skimmers are typically in groups, so you don't necessarily see one. This was one out at Volano Beach recently. I was up in St. Augustine, and there was just one by itself. And I was e-birding, and I saw a black skimmer out there, and I just automatically put down like 5 on my e-bird list because there's always more than one skimmer. And I went back through, and I was like, wait a second, there's only one in there. So every once in a while, you get one by itself. Kind of like seeing one white pelican by itself. It's not something you usually see because they tend to feed in groups. But so this is one I don't know if he smells funny or whatever for whatever reason. The others weren't hanging around with him there, so. But I was at an inlet like skimmers typically are, so. Um, oh, okay. And we'll get the royal terns out there. You do actually see bands on them quite often. If you can, the bands are sometimes you can see that this one has a band on its leg there. And the bands on these birds, if you have good enough optics or good cameras, sometimes you can actually get the numbers off of them and report them to wherever they happen to be. But where whoever's keeping track of bird banding, there's a kind of a clearinghouse area where you can actually go find out. And if you do report it, a lot of times they will actually they'll get back to you eventually and tell you the story of the bird, how many other times it's been resighted, where it was first banded, and all that. So, but they have an orange bill most of the time. Now, I did see one recently had a red bill. When I first started birding, people told me, red is not royal. That's how you tell the Caspian terns, which I didn't pull in a Caspian tern for this presentation, unfortunately. But picture somebody a little bit bigger than this with a salt and pepper forehead and a big red bill. But occasionally they will have red bills. It's fairly uncommon, but the bill is very thin and pointed, and they have this male pattern baldness look for probably like 10 and a half months, maybe 11 months out of the year. For a very brief period in the springtime, they'll have a solid black cap, and they seem to shed that really quickly. So, but when they're actually breeding, which is right around the corner, they'll have a solid black cap. So you may see some out there at the inlet with a black cap like that. But they're kind of classic terns, very thin pointed bill, long pointed wings, very angular, have a bit of a notched tail. That's one of the when you're looking at gulls and terns, like most identification challenges, the first thing you're trying to do is narrow it down to smaller and smaller groups. So gulls and terns look superficially similar to each other, but if it's kind of pointed winged and very slender looking and pointed bills and kind of graceful flying, that's going to be a tern, um, which are our terns aren't too difficult to identify. Terns are can be a bit tough. Gulls are a whole nightmare, and we'll get into those a little bit later. But gulls can be a lot harder to identify. They have a lot more plumages. Terns tend to have they're young and then they're adults. There's not a lot of intermediate plumages with them. So, and a lot of times the young birds look very similar to the adults anyways. So, but these royal terns are primarily coastal. Now, after hurricanes, they'll show up in, places like Lake Weir or Lake Apopka or other inland areas. And they will sometimes wander on their own. Lake Apopka often gets one or two royal terns hanging out there, but they're typically a coastal species. You'll find them offshore, you'll find them along the beaches, you'll find them in the coastal lagoons. We do find them out on Lake Okeechobee, which is kind of interesting, but Lake Okeechobee has several canals that connect it to the coast. So species like royal terns and brown pelicans and even manatees, there's pretty much a resident population of manatees on Lake Okeechobee now and around the canal system out there, and they've come in through that canal, through that connection of canals out there. So we do have some oddly inland terns like that, but typically royal terns. So if you see a big tern inland on a freshwater lake, it's pretty much almost always going to be Caspian terns. And Caspians will be at the beach, so you can get both of them at the beach and in the coastal lagoons. But if you go offshore, The Caspians pretty much stop at the beach. They don't go out offshore. At least I've never seen one go out past the beach. So get a big turn, a big pale turn offshore, it's pretty much going to be royal tern. So the other one that's fairly similar to them is a sandwich tern. Um, they're very another banded bird here actually. They have a similar male pattern baldness look. They are superficially similar in their shape and their flight. They're slightly more slender, a little bit slimmer bill. The bill is thin and black with, as adults, they have that yellow tip on that. You can kind of think of that as having mustard for their sandwich. That's what people will say sometimes. And their voices are actually pretty similar to Royal Tern. I have a hard time separating the two by voice. But these are very, very coastal. I mean, they don't even like to go to the coastal lagoons. Like we don't see them on the Indian River Lagoon over in Brevard County and Indian River County down where I live. You sometimes do see it, but you'll find them around the inlets and they tend to go offshore. They're very comfortable with going offshore. It takes the hurricane usually to drive them inland, and after the hurricane, they quickly find their way back out to the coast. So consequently, in all my county lists, I don't have a whole lot of sandwich terns on inland counties because I don't always go out during hurricanes to go look for birds. I leave that to other people for the most part. But if you want to get sandwich tern in Marion County, next time a hurricane passes by, go out to Lake Weir. You got a decent chance of getting it if you don't get blown off the dock into the lake out there. And then this is in flight. You can kind of see that classic, the long pointed wings, that the not the well, it is a forked tail, a little hard to tell from that angle, and the really thin bill there. And we have a pretty good chance of seeing those when we go out to the on Saturday out to the inlet out there. They typically hang around the inlets a lot. They're actually more common on the Gulf Coast for some reason than the Atlantic coast, although we do get them on both coasts. But if you go down to places like Siesta Key or Lido Key, um, I've seen 500 plus there at Fort DeSoto. I think I've seen up to 1,000 sandwich terns. We never get numbers like that on the East Coast. They like the shallow water of the Gulf Coast, I guess, and the low wave energy better. Terns in general are more common on the Gulf Coast, and gulls more common on the East Coast, actually. And I think a lot of that has to do with just the coastal ecosystems and the high wave energy on the Atlantic side and much lower wave energy on the Gulf side. So. And this is the uncommon tern. You can see a sandwich tern in the background there. Common terns are common along the coasts in the fall. They start to show up in July or so, late July usually. You get the first couple ones coming in, and they peak around October. They're often super common offshore. It's another one that, like the sandwich tern, they do not want to go inland. Oftentimes, if you're out on the coast in October, November, the common terns will spend most of their time out offshore during the daytime, and they'll come in the evening and roost on the beach, and in the morning they'll go right back out again. So if you're in the middle of the day, you may not see a lot of common terns. Now, they will sometimes be around as well, but you'll often see big numbers come in, and often around inlets, kind of similar to sandwich tern in that way. Um, this one's got a little bit, it's covered up. There's a little bit of a carpal bar on it there. They have this, what they call a carpal bar. At the leading edge of the wing is usually pretty dark. I think this is probably a springtime one because it's missing that carpal bar. Um, but the bird that we see that looks a lot like this, and it's coming up next, is the Forster's tern. That's the typical small tern that we see in winter in Florida and occasionally through the summer, but mostly in the same time frame. They come back around August and they're here until probably April or May or so, and maybe a few stragglers over the summer. But one thing you'll notice, there's the black on this goes from the eye and wraps continuously all the way around the back of the nape and around to the other eye there. Um, Forster's terns typically have a black patch around the eye and a white nape, although some individuals, probably younger birds, will have some black on the nape, but there's a distinct contrast between the patch on the eye and the nape, if there is dark on the nape on a Forster's tern. Whereas this is continually wrapped around the back there. They're also smaller, shorter legged. If you're used to looking at terns and looking for things like structure and shape and all that, that's something you might notice. Something I notice. It takes a lot of practice to pick up on that. You'll notice, sandwich terns and royal terns are very similar in overall proportions, but sandwich is just ever so subtly narrower winged and thinner bodied. So when you get terns feeding, a mile or two offshore, and you're looking with your scope at them, and you can't see the color of the bill, and you can't see the relative size and all that, um, you can still kind of tell them apart by that structure, but it takes a lot of experience to do that, so don't beat yourself up if you can't pick it up right away. I've been watching these things for, I don't know, 35 or 40 years. I've been looking at sandwich terns and royal terns, so I've gotten pretty decent at separating them at a distance. And common tern, same sort of thing. It has a slightly more buoyant flight than a Forster's tern, a little bit narrower wings, got a tiny little head compared to Forster's tern, but like I said, that kind of stuff takes a bit of experience to really pick up on. So, and then that's the Forster's tern with the ring-billed gull photobombing him there, but kind of a classic Forster. He does have some black on the nape. Typically, it's completely white head with a black patch on the eye. But you'll notice there's a contrast between the black on the nape and the black on the eye. It's not a continuous wrap around there. Also, very, very white in the wingtips. The wing pattern, the primary patterns can be important. Excuse me, common terns are typically much darker in the wingtips, so there can be some variation in that. Some Forsters can show a bit of dark in the wingtips, but they're usually pretty white. Um, and this is, both common and Forsters are solid black on the cap in the breeding season. That's when it gets really tough to separate them. We don't see that breeding plumage very much in Florida. It's probably a little bit early to see that in March. Some of these birds, like the Forster's terns and common terns well, and Bonaparte's gulls, which Bonaparte's breeds after they leave us. We and then they breed before they molt before they leave us to go to the breeding grounds. After they leave us and go to the breeding grounds, and then they molt again before they come back. So we consequently pretty much never see Bonaparte's gulls in their breeding plumage, which simplifies identification, I guess. One less plumage to deal with. But and Forster's terns, if you see them into April and May, if they're still lingering around then, sometimes they will be in, often will be in breeding plumage. But they're so similar to common terns that the early ornithologists just kind of lumped them together. They didn't realize they were two separate species. They didn't have as good of optics, of course, back in they didn't have optics pretty much. Well, not anything that we would consider, optics back in the 1800s, and a lot of identification took place. They would just, shoot the birds and identify them in the hand. And it took them a while to figure out there's actually two different species here between Forsters and common tern. That happened a lot in the early days, with thrushes and a lot of the shorebirds, because shorebirds we gathered together in huge flocks. So western and semi-palmated sandpipers, it took the ornithologists a little while to realize they were separate species. Once they figured out these birds were migrating to the Arctic to breed, and they started going up and finding them up there, then it helped a little bit because in a lot of cases, adult and immature birds were described as separate, as completely different species, or even spring and fall plumages. And some of the warblers, spring migration, they'd name it one thing, and fall migration, they name it something else because they didn't realize it was the same birds coming back, until eventually they gradually figured that kind of stuff out. So if you can't tell Forsters from common tern easily, don't worry. Some of the best ornithologists couldn't do it either for quite a while. So, and then there's kind of this little transition here between the terns and the gulls. You can see it's very white in the tail, very white in the wings. That's the Forster tern. Again, another one with a dark nape, but you see that contrast between the black patch and the nape. You wouldn't see that on the common tern. And below them is the Bono. I misspelled Bonapartes. I just realized that it's not Bonapartes. Has nothing to do with Sonny and Cher, but the Bonapartes gulls are. I mentioned how. Terns tend to be kind of pointed wings and forked tail, very buoyant looking and kind of bouncy. The Bonaparte's gull, one of our smallest gulls that we see here on a regular basis, is a bit tern-like when they're flying around. And so they can be if they will mix with Forster's terns when they're feeding. There's a Lake Talquin up in Tallahassee area there's a hydroelectric dam and they backed up the river there, and so they created this giant reservoir area, and it gets hundreds and hundreds of Forster terns and Bonaparte skulls in the wintertime there. And if they're on the other side of the lake 2 miles away from you foraging out there, it can be very difficult to tell just how there'd be a group of 500 gulls and terns together and trying to piece together how many are Bonaparte's gulls and how many are Forster's terns is pretty difficult, actually, even with a good scope, because you can see Bonaparte's has that little patch behind the eye, and Forster's has the patch on the eye. They both fly very similar to each other. Bonaparte's is darker gray on the back with a big white patch in it, but um, these subtle little details like this can be hard to pick up at 2 miles away, even with a scope. So it comes down to shape and flight patterns and all and size, and there you can see they're pretty much the same size and they have very similar flight patterns, so it can be quite challenging to separate out what proportion of the group is Bonaparte's and what proportion is Forster's terns. So I don't think too many early ornithologists confused these two species, but certainly from a distance it would have been hard. In the hand, they wouldn't have confused them, but the Bonaparte's is generally our smallest gull that we get in Florida, unless you happen to come across, a little gull, which is, I think, the only other species that's smaller than them. Um, I think I've seen one in Florida, and one in Ohio, and one in Ontario. So that's about it for me on that one. So, and this is a nice shot of an adult Bonaparte skull. You can see very just, it almost has that two-eyed look with that, they have that distinct black patch behind the eye. Um, they look superficially similar to laughing gulls. Bill's a little bit thinner than a laughing gull. The eye is kind of similar to a laughing gull, but the black patch behind the eye is a good mark for them. Unfortunately, laughing gulls, when they're transitioning from their winter plumage to their breeding plumage, sometimes will develop a little black spot behind the eye. Now, they also have a lot of mottling in addition to that, whereas Bonaparte's gulls have that nice clean white head and the black spot behind the eye. And they have that kind of two-eyed look almost. I'm not sure what the adaptation is of that. Adults are just solid gray on the top, on the back rather. And with a white tail. You can't see the white tail on this one. I can see it in some of the other pictures, but we do get variable numbers of Bonaparte skulls. These will show up in inland areas like Lake Weir and Lake Apopka and other inland lakes, as well as coastal areas. They're not one that's likely to go to landfills unless there's standing water that has accumulated food sources for them, because in the Brevard County landfill, we're allowed to go out and go birding out there on a limited area. And this last winter, they had an area that they haven't dumped any trash in. They just have plastic on the ground out there, and that accumulates rainwater. And then the gulls come in there and they're carrying, you know, insect larvae and fish eggs and stuff on their legs because they've been out in the water in the lakes and stuff like that. So they populate these little wet areas with little invertebrates and animal and fish and stuff, and then the Bonaparte gulls discover it, and they come and hang out there. And this last winter, we had another black-headed gull hanging out with them out there too, which is a little bit bigger than the Bonapartes. If we happen to see one out there, I'll go over how to identify it, but I'm not going to get into it tonight because I tend to talk a lot about birds, and I often have to limit myself to the time frame and respect people's time and bedtimes. 9 o'clock is about my bedtime anyways. Um, so this Bonaparte's gull, we should see them. We see them often in coastal areas. We see them on the inlets. Um, I just saw one recently somewhere where I was. I think it was at Black Point today. I think we saw one out there, Black Point Wildlife Drive at Merritt National Wildlife Refuge. Um, but yeah, this was a good year. Their numbers vary quite a bit. Sometimes they stay north of us. Sometimes they're in good numbers. The last couple winters, we've had quite a bit around Sebastian Inlet down in Central Florida and other locations. So we have a decent chance of getting some of these. Hopefully, both adults and immatures, because the young birds look more like this. They have this brown patch on the side of on the wing there, that panel. Um, and you'll notice you can see a little bit on the tip of the tail is black on this one. It has the same pattern on the head with the black patch behind the eye. But that brown panel in the wing is something you see in a lot of gulls. When they get their first plumage, their juvenile plumage, after they lose their down, they grow their first set of feathers. It's usually brown. If you get a chance to see laughing gulls in August, the young laughing gulls, they got a brown head, a brown back, and brown wings, and everything. They're really kind of neat looking, and they're like that for a little while. In September, they will molt, um, and they get more of the white, a little bit more adult-like head on them. They molt in the coverts on and they molt their primaries. They molt their back feathers often into the more adult-like feathers. But for some reason, they keep that little row of scapulars and the or coverts rather in the wing there. So the young birds in that first winter will stand out because they'll have a different colored bar, often a more worn patch. With some of the other gulls I've got pictures of, you'll see kind of a worn patch in there, and they'll molt those feathers eventually usually next spring or summer, and then they'll go into a little bit more adult-like plumage. So down here in Florida, we do tend to see a much higher percentage of young gulls of pretty much all of the species. In the case of laughing gulls, it's because they breed here, but with other gull species, the immatures tend to go further south than the adults do. So when they have a gull festival up at Niagara Falls, up in well, either the Canada side or the United States side up there at Niagara Falls, they have a gull festival up there in November every year for people who want to go freeze and look at gulls by the thousands or tens of thousands. And most of what they're looking at up there is adults because the immature birds tend to come down here. So we deal a lot more with immature herring gulls and lesser blackback gulls and great blackbacks and all that down here, and they have much greater number of young bird or adult birds up there. So which are adult birds are not quite as variable. Immature birds can be more variable. There's not as much selective pressure on immature plumages, so there's a little bit more variation. As long as they get it right, by the time they become adults, then they're good to go. So consequently, we have the more challenging gulls down here. We don't have as many gulls as they do up north, but more challenging and more interesting ones here in Florida. So. And got a couple shots here of another thing that this is an adult Bonaparte's gull. It's plunged under the water to go grab something. They don't really dive very deep, but they kind of drop down into the water a little bit to grab stuff. All white tail. In the United States or American gulls, as young birds, they'll have black in the tail, and as adults, they're all white on the tail. That's not with some of the European gulls. It's the young ones will have all white tails. So that's a quick way to age your birds. If you see any kind of black band in the tail, that's a young bird. And if you see that panel in the wings, it's a very young bird. But Bonaparte's has these white panels on the wings, and they really show up well in flight. White panel with a black on it, and that's you can really see it in the extended wing there. That's another way to separate them from the laughing gulls, which look superficially similar. You can kind of tell that they're a little bit smaller than laughing gulls from this picture. You can't tell it really well, but that big white patch in the end of the wing, and we should theoretically we should see that tomorrow. I think the Bonapartes are usually around until at least mid-April or so. So we're certainly well within the window when they're going to be around. The leg color is also a little bit different. Laughing gulls typically have black legs and a black bill. Bonapartes always have these kind of bright, almost bubblegum pink legs. And you can see in this case, there's a ring-billed gull up here. Ring-bills typically have kind of yellowish green legs. I don't get too heavily into soft part colors in identification. It can be useful, but I find generally if you're close enough to see the color of the legs, you can also see a whole lot of other characteristics about the bird that are going to help you identify it, the structure, the shape of the bill, the color of the back, and all that kind of stuff. But Bonapartes do have those kind of bright pink legs. So sometimes, and Bonapartes are smaller than laughing gulls. So if they're in with the laughing gulls, you might just see a couple of pink legs sticking down in the bottom there, and you don't see them. They're shorter and they're smaller, and they don't really stand out in the amongst the laughing gulls. They will literally like walk right in the middle of laughing gulls and disappear. Um, Franklin's gull will do the same thing. We typically only see Franklin's gulls in the fall, so I'm not worried about them for the Saturday trip. Anyways, so size gulls and terns are somewhat unique. If you go looking at warblers, you get fleeting glimpses of the birds walking around on the ground, or they might be they're flitting around in the trees and all that. You get a couple quick little glimpses. It's hard to study warblers and thrushes and vireos and stuff like that like we can. Gulls, you can literally walk right up to them a lot of times when they're on the beach, and you can just study every single feather on them. And so we know a lot more about individual variations in gulls and terns, than we do in warblers. Presumably there's a lot of variation in warblers as well. It's just, a warbler's not going to sit there for an hour while you study every one of its feathers, but gulls will do that sometimes. So part of the identification challenge and the confusion and all that about the gulls is because we're able to study them so much better, we know so much more about their variation. And with warblers and vireos, we're looking for those couple of Peterson style field marks to get an identification on it, and then the bird's gone, and you don't pick up on all these little subtle variations in them. Also, gulls are bigger than warblers, so you can see the differences a lot better. But people ask me sometimes what's my favorite bird, and I don't have a favorite bird. I don't even have a favorite bird group necessarily, except maybe swallows. I really like watching flying swallows, um, but a lot of times my favorite bird is whatever bird's in front of me or whatever type of birds are in front of me. So on Saturday, it's going to be coastal seabirds and shorebirds are going to be my favorite. And then, next couple of days, I'll be looking for caracaras out in western St. Lucie County. So, crows and caracaras will be my favorites for that time. Although caracaras will drive you nuts when you're trying to find their nests. Sometimes I don't particularly like them. They make my job really hard some days. So anyway, so I won't guarantee it, but we're pretty much going to see Bonaparte's gulls out there. So we'll get a chance to study some of this in the field, and I'll get to show you. We'll put it in the scope. When I'm out there, I'm going to take photographs when I can with the phone scope, and I'll keep a checklist which I can share with the group. When I do that, when I share the checklist, I'll usually go through each species and put comments in there, basically the stuff that I'm telling you either tonight or on the trip on Saturday, or stuff that I forgot to say either tonight or on the trip on Saturday. I'll put in the eBird comments, and I'll put in photographs, and I'll try to put together a little album where I can mark it up. Like you saw some of these photographs so far in the presentation, those are ones I marked up for other groups. And then share that with you guys as well, so you can have that to kind of look at and refresh your memory about all this stuff, because it can be hard to remember all this stuff from a presentation like this. I have a hard time remembering it myself, actually. That's why I always forget stuff when I'm doing this. Um, so laughing gull is our typical, our most common gull in Florida. This is a nice, kind of a classic breeding plumage. He's got the nice slaty gray head. They have very dark, gray backs. The only other thing that comes, well, great black backed is darker, and lesser black backed is about this dark. But all the other gulls are much more of a pearly gray. The herring gulls, the ring-billed gulls, as adults at least, and Bonaparte's gulls will have more of a pearly gray. So these dark gray backed, and the adults, and it takes them about 3 years to mature. So the ones that are 3 year olds or more are probably going to have solid black heads right now. There's a variable amount of red in the bill. Peak breeding condition, they will be very red. Most of the time, they're black. The legs are typically black, but you will see legs where they lack the melanin, and they'll have orange legs, or um, the and you'll see birds even in the wintertime. You'll see birds sometimes with orange bills, but otherwise winter plumage. That's why I'm a little bit leery of using soft part colors to identify. You wouldn't want to identify the birds entirely on the soft. And when I say soft part, that's typically talking about, well, the non-feathered portions of the bird, the bill, the legs, where you can actually see the skin. It's not covered up with feathers. So you may hear that term soft part in reference to, if you hear somebody like me is talking about the soft parts, that's what they're talking about, the bare skin parts of the bird. And those can be pretty variable. Some things will change temporarily. Right now, most of our wading birds, particularly the smaller wading birds, are coming into their breeding conditions, so they're getting the, snowy egrets will very briefly have red lures and red feet instead of the yellow, the typical yellow. They'll be orange for a little bit leading up to that bright red, and I think they're in that bright red plumage for like literally a day or so. It's very hard to capture them in that pure red. It's usually orange for a while, a couple of days before and after the red, and then it goes back to yellow. And gulls will do the same sort of thing. And we'll see a lot of variation in laughing gull, but we probably should see a lot of laughing gulls out there, and we'll see a good bit of variation in their plumage. So this one's a youngster. This is actually a youngster and an oldster, I guess here. This is winter plumage without the black head. Now some of the younger, maybe 2 year old laughing gulls will also have the variable amount of black in the head, but not the solid black head. But um, this one. Yeah, just to make sure I didn't accidentally. Yeah, this is he's got the brown panel on the wings, so he's a young bird. He almost looks like Franklin's gull. I'm gonna take a second look at it. Actually, shit, I don't think that might be Franklin's gull. I might have misidentified this one. But I don't see the white tips on the wings there. But he does look a little bit. No, he's laughing. I'm sorry, he's a laughing gull. He's almost Franklin's gull with that almost half hood look to him. But I don't know. That might be Franklin's skull, actually, now that I'm looking at it more closely. So, see, even experts can make mistakes like that because he's a bit definitely smaller than the laughing gull. But the thing that throws me is that the tips of the wings down here, there's not a lot of white. Typically, Franklin's gulls show white tips on the primaries, and you don't see that in laughing gulls. Um, but that bill is kind of small there, so I'll have to go back and check that picture again. But Laughing and Franklin's look pretty much the same, except the bill is a little bit thinner on a Franklin skull, that half-hooded look, and typically white tips on which I'm not seeing on this bird on the primaries here. So it makes me think it's probably just a small laughing gull. There is a lot of individual variation in size in the gulls, and we hopefully will see that if we have a bunch of loafing gulls out there. You will see males are much bigger than females, so within the same species, you can see quite a bit of size variation in them. We probably will see that, particularly with the larger gulls, the herring gulls, but even within laughing gulls, we'll see that. Um, and this is a first fall laughing. I say first fall. This is a bird. I think I was photographed in maybe August or September. I don't have the dates in front of me on this, but it's got a tremendous amount of brown on the bird, on the head, on the hood here, and on the wings. But you can see that gray is coming in there on the back, and the gray will come in on the lower part of the wing here. This brown in the middle will stay there. The head will get white, often a little bit of blotchy brown, blotchy black on the head, but mostly white. But most all of this brown will gradually disappear as as the fall progresses. There's a lot of it. I've seen birds in similar plumage to this on into December and January sometimes. So some of them they just don't molt as fast as others, and some will molt really quickly. And by August they may be already into that first winter plumage. As I called this one first fall because he's got so much brown on him. It's got to be a fall plumage bird. We won't see this on Saturday. I just threw this in here to show some variation in the molt there. This is more of something you would see in the fall. By March, the adults have the blackheads, and the young birds will have. A lot of last year's young will have actually replaced that brown panel. Some of them will have replaced that brown panel by now. Some might not replace it until next summer. Again, there's a lot of individual variation in them. And there's not a lot of selective pressure on molt cycles as long as, like I say, if they by the time they reach adulthood, if they've got their plumage right, then they can pass on those genes. So as long as they survive that long, their molt doesn't get them in trouble with predators or whatever, there's not really much selective pressure to conform basically. So and this okay, this is another example of the immature and the adult. I think I overdid it with the signage on this one here, but you can see this is kind of a typical winter immature laughing gull. He's got this smudgy on the head, not as white as the adult. They both have the slaty gray color on the back, but you got that brown panel, those brown feathers. So this is, theoretically could have been the same bird that we saw earlier, just later in its molt, and it replaced all those brown feathers except for the panel on the wing there. So that typical immature plumage of the of gulls in general, having that brown panel in that first year of life there, and that's those juvenile feathers that they don't replace until usually the next spring or summer after they're hatched. So, and then here's the ring-billed gull, again brown patch on the side there. Our ring-billed gulls, typically you will get some that have the juvenile plumage still on them, but a lot of them will molt before they come down here. So they have that kind of pearly gray on the back that the adults tend to have. They'll often have that in that first winter. So, but we do see some that still have the brown speckles across the back. Again, there's a lot of individual variation. Their legs are typically pink when they're young. A lot of gulls have pink legs when they're young. Ring-billed gulls have a ring around the bill most of the time. Some of them will have a solid dark tip, but almost all of them have a little bit of pink right on the end there. So even as young birds, they have the ring around the bill there, that solid black ring. Most gulls have some sort of patches of black or red on the bill, but the ring-billed gull has that solid ring around the tip of the bill. Younger birds tend to have darker bills than older birds. In general, but you will see some like when we get further down to the herring gulls typically have a little bit of pink at the base of the bill and a dark tip, and lesser blackback gulls for the first year or two of life have solid black bills. It's not 100%, but that's generally the way it is. And both species, as they get older, get progressively less and less of the dark on the bill, progressing towards the adult plumage where they just have a few black spots on the bill. But that has the typical brown panel. We will likely see some of these birds. Now, some of the birds from last year might already have lost that brown panel. It's unlikely, but we might see a few birds that still have the speckling on the back that haven't molted in the scapulars on the back yet. But by now, most of them have that. Um, but that's our second most common gull. The laughing gull is the most common. Um, ring-billed typically is the second most common. Inland areas are more likely. Laughing gull tends to stay fairly coastal. They will come into some of the larger bodies of water. They come into Lake Okeechobee quite a bit, and they will come into landfills and coastal areas. But they typically stay more to the coast. You know, you do see occasional birds inland in other areas, but ringbills are much more prevalent in inland areas. Laughing gulls spend most of their time in coastal areas. Ring-billed gulls will migrate inland to breed, so being inland is not as foreign to them as it is for laughing gulls. Laughing gulls are pretty much strictly coastal breeders, and they spend most of their time on the coast. So now we might see some of these ring-billed gulls will get into breeding condition pretty early on. As adults with the in breeding condition, their legs turn kind of a yellowish color. Sometimes the adults are kind of greenish in the wintertime, but you can see he's got everything going on. He's got the nice ring around the bill. He's got the red iris. A lot of gulls. Sometimes you can separate species of gulls by the color of the skin, not the iris, the orbital ring, that little patch of skin that doesn't have any feathers on it right around the eye there. The color of that can sometimes come into play in identifying, some of the rare gulls or the herring gulls and types. And you can see a little bit of the red at the gape spot there on him there. So we'll likely see a few of these inbreeding plumage out there. They have much less streaking on the head. Full breeding condition, I think they'll have a completely white head. So he's retaining a little bit of winter plumage on the back, but he's mostly in breeding plumage there. They have that kind of pearly gray back, pretty similar to herring gulls, maybe slightly darker on average than herring gulls, but not nearly as dark as you see on the laughing gulls. And we should see a fair number of these in various plumages of ring-billed gulls. But I wouldn't be surprised there's a couple of adults already in breeding condition out there. So, and then this is the winter one here. He's kind of they sleep a lot in the winter apparently, but kind of greenish legs there. The bill is a little bit greenish, but he's got the solid gray on the back there. So if anybody wants to take a guess at what's behind them there, we're getting to those other species. But that's a herring gull to the right, and that's actually a great blackback gull behind it on the left there. So we'll be moving into them a little bit. So lesser blackback's the next biggest one after. I'm going up in size. So, laughing gull, ring-billed gull, lesser blackback gull. Lesser blackback has a real interesting history in Florida. They're still, as far as we know, most of their breeding occurs in Greenland and Iceland and over in Europe. There was one bird I think was nesting in Maine that was hybridizing with herring gulls, and both that bird and its hybrid offspring would show up at in the Daytona Beach Shores area, just north of Ponce Inlet, where we'll be. Whoops, let's go back. Um, so we knew because they were banded, we knew who they were, and for about 6 years, that adult showed up with its offspring out there. The hybrid offspring, which I'm not even going to get into hybrid gulls right now. That's a very advanced subject, and gull nerds like to deal with that. I don't know how much I like to deal with it, but anyways, these guys, when they were adults, they have the yellow legs. Um, they do have a little bit of a spot, black and red on the bill. The variable amounts of streaking. Some of them have almost, it looks like, brown mustard on their head in the wintertime. They just have this really dense streaking on it. This bird's probably actually transitioning into spring plumage. I have it marked as a winter bird, but it's actually probably coming into breeding plumage there. The back is actually pretty similar in color to laughing gulls. Hopefully we will see that on Saturday, but they winter in huge numbers, and they almost have to be breeding somewhere in North America, you would think, unless they're all coming from Greenland down here. But you go to the Cocoa landfill these days, and you might see 300 of these out there. I can remember in 1987, I think it was 87, going out to Port Canaveral because a rare lesser blackback gull had been reported out there. and we all came out to see it because it was a life bird for all of us. Because we just hadn't, we hadn't picked. They're up in the northeastern U.S. at that time. They just weren't coming down to Florida that much, and so we're, studying this gull and seeing if it has yellow legs on it, and so we could identify it by its yellow legs. Everything about this bird is different than herring gulls and great blackback gulls and all that, but we were keying in on the yellow legs as the identification point on it. So, but it has a slaty gray back. It has it's smaller than herring gulls, bigger than ring-billed gulls. They have longer wings. Which one of the last pictures of them kind of shows the long wings on them. The long winged look is another one of those things that takes a little bit of practice. When they're flying, they do have a noticeably longer wings than other gulls, and their wingtips will stick out a little bit more beyond the tail. That's another one of those subtle differences that you pick up on over time. Um, but these youngsters kind of superficially resemble herring gulls. But one of the differences, they tend to be much more neatly patterned on the back and even underneath. They have kind of this nice checkering underneath and white, white with little brown marks all over them. Herring gulls tend to be very smudgy. It looks like, somebody painted them when it was wet and they smeared the paint all over the place, and the backs are usually pretty dark on them. And again, these are pretty long wings sticking out here beyond the tail. And it gives it kind of a slender look. Herring gull has a much more husky look to it, much bigger head to it. And again, I mentioned earlier, solid black bill. You rarely ever see a completely black bill on a young herring gull. It does happen sometimes. I've seen it happen. And they also have a little bit of this mean-eyed look. They have this they have these fine specks all over the head, and they tend to coalesce around the eye and give it kind of an eye patch almost, and kind of a little bit of a mean look to them. It's pretty variable. This one's not as mean as some of the ones I've seen before, but but if you see something that's a brown immature gull, it kind of superficially resembles a laughing gull. Because initially we had a hard time separating these from young herring gulls because we never had to separate other young brown gulls from herring gulls before. But you notice, and I started picking up pretty quickly, the mean eye patch and just the much neater look. The little checkers on the back, the white and speckles, not the smudgy look, but the much more neat, crisp look underneath, and they're more slender. They just have that kind of long wings and long and variation in size can be so great that a really big male lesser blackback gull can approach the size of a really small herring gull. So they do tend to sort out well by size, but size extremes can get very close to each other. I saw a female great blackback gull at Daytona Beach shores that it was about the size of a herring gull. It's one of the smallest great blackback gulls I've ever seen, actually. Um, so you do occasionally, and you'll get some just huge beasts of herring gulls that are still clearly herring gulls, even though they're monstrous. Some of the big males can approach the size of smaller female great blackback gulls. But generally speaking, when they're together, you can often sort them out by size. Just remember the progression: laughing, ring-billed, lesser black-backed herring, and then great blackback. Nothing's bigger than great black-backed. They're the biggest gull in the world, actually. Um, and we tend to get them almost exclusively on the Atlantic coast of Florida. Though they do show up on the West Coast, but much less numbers. Lesser blackback gulls are much more prone to show up on the West Coast of Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, and even inland as far over as California and Colorado and places like that. Whereas great blackback gulls almost, I mean, you don't even see them on the Gulf of Mexico as much less, in inland areas. And another odd difference between lesser blackback gulls I mentioned before, you can get up to 300 lesser blackback gulls at the Cocoa landfill. The high count I've had of great blackback gulls was two, and that was kind of surprising. One is almost surprising out there. Great blackbacks just don't take to dumps, at least here in Florida. Now up in the Northeast, they might go to dumps more often than they do here, but they tend to stay on the coast in this area. Um, and this one's a second winter. I'm judging it as a second winter bird because it's starting to get the color. It's still very much a young bird, the pink legs, a lot of markings on it, but it's getting the slaty gray on the back there, which is something they typically, the 4-year gulls, often they won't get that color on the back of the adults until the second winter. Um, and some gulls, like laughing gulls, will pretty much they'll mature in about 2 years, maybe three. Ring-billed gulls take 3 years to mature, so they have a few in between plumages. Lesser blackback gulls, herring gulls, great blackback gulls, those all take 4 years to mature. So they don't acquire the adult back plumage typically until their second winter, but they'll still have a lot of brown. They'll have a black line in the tail that immatures typically have. And they're still young birds, but they're starting to show some characteristics of adults. And in the third winter, some third winter lesser blackbacks or even herrings and great blackbacks can look very much like adults. There's still going to be some subtle differences, usually a little bit dark in the bill, a little bit extra smudge on them. They typically don't lose the black in the tail until they're fully adults. So they won't have the full solid white tail until they're fully an adult. And on the flip side, 4-year-old gulls that are theoretically adults occasionally will retain a few little juvenile characteristics in that first year as a full adult, and it won't may not be until their 5th year that they look completely like an adult. So when I put this in here, it's not a great picture. It's actually probably a third. I said that's its feet sticking out there. I don't know if that's, yeah, that's probably not the dark. A little bit dark in the tail there, but I think that's probably not. Maybe just an artifact of the picture, but it's have very long wings on them and very slaty back on it. And this one happens to be in a heavy molt. He's molting both his primaries and secondaries, so you can see the gaps in there where the new feathers are growing in. But that structure there, a herring gull would have much broader wings than that. Great blackback gull would look like a goose practically where it's flying. So that long narrow wings like that, and the wings sticking beyond the tail, that's a good field mark for them. Terrible picture, but it does demonstrate the shape of the bird there. So and now we get into the herring gulls. And you have some skimmers photo bombing us here, but herring gull, look what a beast this thing. This is a nice adult. It's got the yellow eye. The eye tends to be darker as younger birds. Just a nice yellow bill with a little bit of black and red on it there. Pearly gray on the back there. It has pink legs, except this little rude little skimmer got in the way there, but trust me, it has pink legs. Kind of bubblegum pink, but that kind of pearly gray, similar to the ring-billed gull, maybe average is slightly darker than the ring-billed gull, but a big, heavy, round-bodied beast of a bird with a big head there. If there's no great blackback gulls around, these are going to be the the biggest gulls that you're going to typically see. We actually see a lot more immatures, but we should see some adult herring gulls out there at the Lighthouse Park on Saturday when we're out there. So hopefully. So. And then this is a young bird. You see how smudgy it looks underneath, very smudgy brown. A little bit of pale at the base of the bill on it there. Bigger, heavier bill. That's a little bit of a subtle difference. The wingtips don't stick out quite. It's doesn't have that long winged, slender look that a lesser blackback gull would have, and it's certainly much more smudgy brown underneath on it here. And it does have that panel in the wing. This is probably late in the winter because this panel is really worn. So those feathers, those juvenile feathers get pretty old by the time if they don't molt them out by the next summer. Occasionally you might find a bird that's not doing too well, is not very healthy, and they don't molt in those new feathers. And by the end of the next summer, those feathers are just almost worn down to the shafts, actually. Those are birds that are probably not going to make it to adulthood because they're not eating enough or they're sick or not molting. But you will occasionally get in the late summer, you'll find these birds where they never did molt that panel out and it's just completely, threadbare. Um, This one's getting fairly worn, but I think this is probably late winter. It'll eventually molt those feathers out and be some nice gray feathers in there instead. So, now this one is a really pale herring gull. I had to look at it a little bit to make sure, but it's just, typically they're smudgy brown. This is like smudgy, creamy almost on it, but he does have the gray on the back, and he's got the, you know, bigger head and all that, and a bigger body than a ring-billed gull would have. But so we may see some gulls like this out there. That's one of the more unusual plumage, and this is again fairly worn. Kind of weird looking bill on this guy here, but still kind of husky looking. He's getting some of the gray in the back, on his back there. A little bit at our start, he might be getting ready to replace this panel a little bit here. Very white underneath in the head again. It's kind of a weird, herring gulls typically aren't that white, but you do get some variations in them like that. So um, that's kind of the typical um, big bruise. This is probably a male. He's big. This one has an all dark. Well, I marked, I should say that's not usually all dark bill on immatures. I think I marked that note incorrectly on there, but typically this is one of those herring gulls that does have a solid dark bill on it. Most of them will show at least a little bit of pink at the base of the bill here. You see how much bigger he is than the laughing gull back behind him there. I mean, he just kind of dwarfs that laughing gull. Very smudgy brown all over, dark primaries on him. One of the interesting things about them, and I don't know if it's the next thing or not, but they have the dark primaries, but the inner primaries are actually pale. So when the wing is extended, there's a little pale patch in the wing. But we will likely see some immature herring gulls out there with the big brown, big smudgy brown, big bruisers of birds out there. Yeah, here's a shot with it in the wing. These outer 10 feathers here are the primary feathers. That's the outermost flight feathers. And those inner feathers have a little pale panel on them there as young birds. And that's pretty much diagnostic for herring gulls. It's hard to observe because, they have to have their wings out like that, and their wings are usually moving when they're out. So, but it's something that can help you to identify if you're not sure if it's a herring gull or lesser blackback gull. Lesser blackback would be solid black all the way across the trailing edge there. Herring gulls have this little panel on the inner primaries there. So that's something somebody pointed that out to me. I didn't figure that out on my own. That was something I learned a while back, and then since then I've kind of learned to look for that. Um, it's not 100%. I think there might occasionally be some herring gulls that don't have that pale panel in there too. Gulls are just that way. They have to be a little bit different like that just to annoy us and make it more difficult to identify them. But he might occasionally. So it's pretty much if it doesn't have the panel, it's probably not a herring gull. But it's not 100%. It's like 99.999% maybe. So okay, so here's a herring gull on the right, usually our biggest, baddest gull, unless you have one of these guys around, this big bruiser of a great blackback gull. A great blackback gull pretty much always has a solid black bill as a young bird. And that bill has a little bit of a bulb on it. It's thicker, and it actually is thicker at the tip than it is at the base. Notice it's a bad angle on this particular photo here, and they look kind of superficially like a herring gull, but with a lot more white, particularly in the head. And again, a little bit more of the pattern of a lesser blackback gull with the more neatly patterned underneath. Often very white underneath on these guys. Once they get into their second winter, then they get the big black patch on the back because they have a solid dark black on their mantle on the back and the top of the wings. So once you get into the second winter, then it's a lot easier because you get the big black patch on the back. But as first winter birds, they sort of superficially resemble herring gulls and lesser blackback gulls, but they just got that great big bill, big blocky head, and they're basically bigger than everybody else around out there. This is the rare great blackback gull at the Cocoa landfill here. So Again, kind of that bill kind of expands out a little bit towards the tip there. Has kind of a much bigger head. Variable amount of white underneath. They're typically much whiter than herring gulls of the same age. And even a bit thicker legs, I think, as well. And just kind of big bruising body on them. We should see a few great blackbacks around, maybe adults and immatures on Saturday out around the park out there. So I hope so. Um, and then this is a nice adult and breeding plumage, and they'll get like that. They have pink legs. You can't quite see it too well in here. All white on the top, nice big yellow bill. Again, kind of the bill bulges out at the tip there. He's got the gape spots there, so the babies know to beg for food and peck at the little bill there, so the adults will feed them. But a very dark black on the back there, and just that huge chest on them, and big blocky head. At any age, they just have that big, robust look and the big block head and the great big bill. Um, so, I mean, and a decent chance we're going to get those out there um, on Saturday. They do tend to like the inlets. We do typically see them around Ponce Inlet a lot. Now, there's a rare gull out there, and this one there's a Heermann's gull, which is typically on in California in the West Coast, but there is one around. This is what he looked like as a youngster. He's just kind of solid brown, solid rump, solid tail, everything just kind of a chocolate brown color as young birds. We've only had a few Heermann's gulls show up in Florida. When they have, they've tended to stick around for years. They show up as an immature and they hang out until they're adults. Unfortunately, I don't have a good picture of the adult. There has been one. The reason I mention this is there has been a Heermann's gull hanging out on the south side of the inlet out there, and they do often come in and feed in the inlet there. So hopefully we will see them, see what that bird. This is the picture I got out in Ponce Inlet. You can't see it too well because it's a terrible photo, but he's kind of a dark gray all over with this white panel, white strip right on the secondaries in the back there. Has kind of a blood red bill and a dark band on the end of the tail there. So he is an adult now, this bird that's been hanging out in the Atlantic coast for a while. It's been seen as far down south as Palm Beach County, and as far north. I think it's gone as far north as Duval County up in Jacksonville. I'm not sure if it's gone to Georgia or not, but it's been roaming up and down the coast. Apparently, it's hanging out in Ponce Inlet right now, so we might get to see that. That's the bird you typically go to California to see. There are tons of them out there. We don't see nearly as many around here, so I've only seen a couple. So now we get into shorebirds, the other fun things. Willets are a very striking bird in flight and basically gray with a little straight gray bill and kind of blue-gray legs and just gray and white when they're sitting. We probably will see these out there. There are likely two species of willet that occur in North America. The ones that we get here all winter are the western willets that go out and breed in the Great Plains in Canada and the Midwestern US. Um, the ones that breed here, which willet is one of the few shorebirds that breeds in Florida, they winter in South America pretty much exclusively. The eastern willet, which breeds from Texas all the way around the Florida coast, all the way up to New Jersey. Those eastern willets, which are a little bit smaller and thicker build and more darkly marked in the breeding season. They will show up sometimes in March, usually more like late March, and migrants will pass through at the same time our western willets are getting ready to go up to breed out in Canada. So for a little while in April, you might get a chance to see both species next to each other. They're currently considered subspecies, but that's probably going to change in the next year or two. So you'll have to start looking more closely at willets. It's pretty easy in the wintertime. They're all western willets in the wintertime. I don't think eastern's been documented in North America yet. But easterns could be coming back by now. Eastern is one of those ones that, like the Bonaparte's gull, they well, in their case, we don't see them in winter plumage, unlike the Bonaparte's gull, which we don't ever see in breeding plumage. The eastern willets will molt before they migrate back to North America, and then they don't molt again until they go back down to South America. So we never see them in non-breeding plumage. I think there has been a couple cases where they've documented a non-breeding eastern willet late in the season that was moving south through Texas or Florida. But so if it's in winter plumage and it's winter time, it's a western willet. That makes it a whole lot easier until somebody discovers eastern willets wintering in Florida or something, and then we'll have to scrutinize them a little bit more. But that's kind of what they typically willets. We see willets on the beaches a lot. This is a western willet. It has a longer, thinner body. That's a real tough ID challenge, but it's going to be something we have to start thinking about soon, I guess, because and I do have some pictures of breeding plumage eastern willets in here, but this is kind of a elongated body, a little bit longer legs than an eastern willet would have, a little bit longer bill, not quite as thick. And of course, it's in winter plumage, which are non-breeding plumage, which we never see the easterns in that non-breeding plumage. I think that's another one, just kind of, it's a little bit better. But if you said long, straight bill, the bill on an eastern would be shorter and thicker than that, although there is some variation in that. But typically it's going to be shorter and thicker than that, and not and a little bit chunkier in the body and shorter legged. This is an eastern. Westerns never get this dark, this much checkers and marks underneath. They're a lot whiter underneath. This bill is shorter and thicker. Um, this body's a little bit thinner, a little bit smaller than a Western. It's actually kind of approaching Western in structure there a little bit shorter legs, but that kind of thick bill. And again, these are subtle differences that you pick up on over time. But Western willets, when we do get Westerns in breeding plumage before they leave in the springtime, or if they're coming back in the fall, they're never this heavily marked on the back or on the head and neck. Again, there's variation in them. Maybe sometimes they do, but these are the ones that will display and will be out in the salt marshes and the mangrove and openings in the mangrove swamps and where they nest in the coastal areas. The western ones leave us to breed. So these little guys, the non-ruddy turnstone most of the year, they turn kind of a bright orange color on the back in the springtime. You might see a few this early. Usually it's later towards April, May. You start seeing the orange on the back on them and then more defined black on here. Bright orange legs at all times. Little stubby bill that has, it's kind of a stout little bill. They're considered a sandpiper, but they're almost in between sandpiper and plover. So when we get, we talked about the gulls and terns earlier and some of the differences between them. When you get into shorebirds, the two major groups are plovers and sandpipers. And sandpipers tend to have more thin pointed bills, smaller eyes. They're tactile feeders. They're not necessarily looking for something to grab. They're going and poking in the substrate, the mud or the sand or whatever, to find stuff, little aquatic and or estuarine or marine invertebrates and worms and stuff like that, and bugs and things. Whereas plovers have little stubby bills and have a big head and big eyes because they're often looking for something to grab. They don't want to make the effort to go grab at something unless they know there's something there, as opposed to shorebird or sandpipers rather, just kind of probing around looking in the mud for anything that might happen to be in there. So plovers consequently have bigger eyes, have a bigger head to accommodate those bigger eyes, and they have more of a stubby bill because they're going after bigger things, worms, sometimes even little crabs and stuff like that. And their feeding behavior is different too. Plovers will often, they'll run a little bit and then stop and look, and then they'll run a little bit and stop and look, kind of like what robins do and they're feeding in the lawns. Whereas sandpipers, where they're just tactile feeders, they're just kind of walking along probing all over the place. And now turnstones, they really like rocky shorelines, and we really don't have natural rocky shorelines here in Florida, in the peninsula at least. It's all sand from the Appalachian Mountains that's been eroding for a million, billion years or whatever. It's formed this giant sand dune that we call the Florida Peninsula here. But in coastal armament, they bring in this, uh, well, bring in the rocks from the Appalachian Mountains, and other places, and they put the rocks out in the inlets, and obviously crustaceans and stuff get on there, and barnacles and whatever. And so we make this really interesting, this habitat that's similar to what we see up north, and turnstones take to it. Purple sandpipers, you pretty much almost never find them away from these rock jetties. Eiders, when they come down, they tend to hang around those rock jetties because they find the kind of food that they need there. They're not really finding what they need in the sandy substrate, but they find the stuff living on the rocks there. So these little artificial habitats that we've created to maintain the inlets out there have been a boon to some species. That hopefully we'll see the purple sandpipers tomorrow. That where we're going, Ponce Inlet is basically the southernmost point that purple sandpipers show up reliably every year. There are we had one at Sebastian Inlet this year, but we don't get them at Sebastian Inlet every year. They show up at Jetty Park sometimes. They show up even as far south as the Keys. But purple sandpiper, which is coming up in either next or after the Sanderling, they like those rocky shorelines, and they come down to Ponce Inlet every year. They're kind of a pain. These guys here will feed all over the place. They get all on the rocks. They get up on the fishing piers and look for handouts, people throwing out scraps of bait and stuff like that. They'll come around picnic tables and eat, popcorn and potato chips and stuff like that as well. They can become a little bit of a pest sometimes, but they'll be all over the piers and stuff. And purple sandpipers are a little bit more picky about where they like to feed. They like to pick, this is a purple sandpiper, which is kind of about the same size as the ruddy turnstone. They're not purple. I don't know where they get purple from for some of these birds. They're not like purple martin is purple. Purple sandpiper is not purple. It's kind of it should would have been better called a gray sandpiper, I guess, but that's not so sexy as purple, I guess. But anyways, this is what they look like in the wintertime. They have a little bit of a white eye ring, kind of a orange base of the bill, a little bit of curve to the bill, orange legs, kind of smudgy on the chest there. But they feed down on the algae. They pick around in the algae on these rocks out here. So at high tide, they'll come out and just kind of sit on the tops of the rocks because all their algae is covered up. They don't have any place to feed. The turnstones can still feed at high tide if they want to, but these guys just kind of hang out. I'm not sure where they hang out at Ponce Inlet because I don't usually find them at high tide out there. So they've got, at Sebastian Inlet, I know where they like to go during the high tide. There's a certain couple of flat rocks by the tidal pond that they tend to go sit on. But so you'll find these guys, and it makes it really frustrating to see them because there's all these rocks out here in the jetty, and they're going down between the rocks. So they'll pop up on the top of the rock briefly, and you'll see it, and then they're back down below. And so I've gone to Ponce Inlet and not gotten these things before because they were down between the rocks and never bothered to come up to the top. They were feeding on the algae down in there. We do often have a unique opportunity when you walk on the civilized part of the pier on the north side there on the nice flat concrete area. You go up to the railing at the end there and you look down, and oftentimes you can see purple sandpipers right there because you can look down between the rocks. So if they happen to be there down between the rocks, you can still see them. If you're looking across and they're between the rocks, you're pretty much out of luck for seeing these things. But we'll be there for a little bit. We'll hopefully have a chance to see these guys out there. It's fun to watch them feed out there. I've actually gotten video of them feeding right off the end of the boardwalk or the walkway out there. Um, and so hopefully, it's not a guarantee. There should be some still around. Whether we'll actually get a chance to see them or not will depend somewhat on the tides and whether they decide to feed on the rocks where we can actually see them. This is another one here. Either the same one or I think there was two that day I was photographing there. But you see them kind of picking around in there. Those bright orange legs, kind of similar to the turnstone in that sense, but more of a gray color overall. A little bit of an eye ring on them. So hopefully that's one you'll see. That's another one that rarely ever shows up. We don't even see them on the Gulf Coast of Florida that often, much less inland areas. I think there's been one or two inland reports, but they're pretty much a bird of the rocky jetties and mostly the Atlantic coast. So these guys hang out with the turnstones a lot. They have three toes. There's no hind toe on the back side of these. So that was one of the ways that, yeah, I was reading up recently on Ken Kaufman's book on the birds that Audubon missed, and he has a whole lot of interesting insights into early, the pitfalls of early taxonomy and the early birders, and with the lack of technology and stuff. One of the things that they would look at to classify the shorebirds was the toes, the number of toes on them, and these guys just have the three toes without the hind toe. I don't remember what they if they called them plovers or not, but a lot of the sandpipers were initially called plovers when in the old if you look at some of the older bird names, they would call them plovers, and they hadn't really figured out a lot of the taxonomic differences. There was shorebirds were frustrating and gulls were frustrating for early ornithologists as well as current bird watchers as well. But anyway, so the number of toes, but this one they've lost the hind toe entirely. They just have the three toes on them. Most birds have four. And they're the ones that are mostly known for running in and out with the tides. They hang out with turnstones a lot, but they have different feeding behaviors. The breeding plumage is completely different on this. We don't really see much breeding plumage, except maybe in the fall when they just return, we'll see them kind of. But typically we see them. They're just solid black legs, solid black bill, a little bit of a decurve to it. They're about the same size as a Dunlin, which we may see out there. Very, very white, like no streaking underneath on them at all, and kind of a silvery gray back, a little black shoulder patch usually right around the bend of the wing. There's a little patch of black on them, and they're very fast, running in and out with the tides as the waves come in. All the little marine worms and stuff come up to the surface and filter out whatever they can get out of the waters from the waves, and these guys come in behind the wave and try and grab the little worms before they go back into the sand and disappear in there. So that's why they're following around, and they will get hit by the waves every once in a while. If you, I've seen them occasionally, didn't turn around in time as they're running down towards the wave or whatever. So, but for the most part, they're pretty good at timing the waves. But um, every once in a while, you might see one get hit. And then we get into the plovers. There's a lot more sandpipers than what I was showing you, but you see mostly you don't see as many sandpipers on the beaches. You see them mostly in freshwater marshes or salt marshes and places like that. So we're gonna get into the plovers a little bit. I just got one shot of this. The semi-palmated plover is one of the banded plovers. So when you get it down to plover, and you can see he's got a stubby little bill on him, and kind of a big eye, rounded head there. If you watch him feed, he'll run along and look, and then pick at stuff, and run along and look. But within the plovers, you've got the banded plovers. They have the breast band on them, and that's in Florida at least, semi-palmated snowy Wilson's and piping plover. We don't have to worry too much about snowy plover on the Atlantic coast. They pretty much stay to the Gulf Coast. There's a few resident populations along the Gulf Coast, and then occasionally we get migrants along the Gulf Coast. And those migrants do sometimes show up on the Atlantic coast. So it does occasionally happen that you get a snowy plover on the Atlantic coast. Not commonly, but every once in a while. So um, but these guys have fairly bright orange legs. And again, soft part color with the plovers, it's actually pretty reliable. The color of the legs is actually pretty reliable. And little orange base of the bill there. Pretty nice and dark brown on the back, and pretty robust band around the breast there. They're very small. They're often one of the most common of the small plovers. It's called semi-palmated. If you use your imagination, you can see a little bit of a partial webbing between the toes there. That's actually one of the differences. There's a species in Europe called the ringed plover. It looks almost exactly like this, but the ringed plover only has webbing between one set of toes, and this one has webbing between both sets of toes on the three toes going forward there. Very hard to observe that in the field, but if you have a specimen, you can see that, I guess. But we do occasionally get common ringed plovers up in the Northeast, usually, typically, but the calls are different, and that's usually how you separate them. As far as I know, no one's ever had a ringed plover here in in Florida. But if you get one of these and it sounds a little bit weird, then you grab him and look at his feet and see if he has webbing between both sets of toes. And if he doesn't, then he's a ring plover. But um, the one of the other ones, and we do get a fair number of these around the Ponce Inlet area and other and on the West Coast. Piping plovers, they're an endangered or threatened species at least. Some of them breed up in the Northeast along the beaches, and obviously there's a lot of competition for beaches in the summertime up north. They have a very short summer. Here we have about 12 months of summer here in Florida. Up north, there's a lot of demand during that breeding season for people want to go out on the beaches out there. So there's a lot of conflict sometimes between the piping plovers nesting up there, um, and the people using the beaches up there. So, but they are superficially similar to semi-palmated plovers, but much paler on the back. These are actually fairly dark examples of a piping plover. Some are quite a bit paler than that. Blend in with the sand a little bit more. Solid black on the bill. They don't have that orange base on the bill. And the legs, you can't see it quite as well here. Legs are more pinkish on these guys here. There's a decent chance we'll get some piping plovers and maybe semi-palmated plovers out there at the inlet. They do winter. That is one of the areas that they winter in. So if we do see some, the solid black, little tiny bill on them, more diffuse band and much, much grayer, not nearly as dark as a semi-palmated plover. We do see them quite a bit on the west coast of Florida, around Fort DeSoto and places like that. Siesta Key, I think you get them over there. But we do get them. Ponce Inlet's one of the places we do see them pretty regularly in the wintertime. This is, you can see a little bit more of the kind of legs look a little bit more orange. It's a little more pinkish a lot of times in these guys, but the light can play tricks on you. Sometimes they don't have a complete breast band. This one here, the band kind of comes in part way, but doesn't go all the way through. Again, the solid black on the bill. Much paler gray, almost sand colored, compared to the darker brown of the semi-palmated plover. And then we do get Wilson's plovers out there. Sometimes they'll stay all winter. One thing that this almost looks like a little tiny killdeer with one band. They have a much bigger bill, much longer and thicker bill, bigger head to go with the muscles attached to this big bill here, even bigger eye. A lot of variation in the amount of band on them. The legs are much more pinkish, kind of a pale pink color. If they're with the semi-palmated plovers and the piping plovers, they are noticeably larger, but that bill is just huge, and they eat bigger food items. They eat, small crabs and things like that more so than just, insect larvae and stuff or worms and stuff like that. So they got that big crab crunching bill. You see that with other species, like if you've seen young night herons. Young night herons can be very hard to separate from each other, but one of the differences is yellow-crowned night herons have that kind of short, blunt, crab crunching bill. I mean, yellow crowns are almost crab specialists. They really like, I mean, they'll live in inland areas too where there's not any crabs, and they'll eat fish and other stuff too. But they have that thick bill compared to the young black-crowned night heron has a little bit of thinner, longer bill, kind of a subtle difference, but it's actually a little more obvious difference. But it's analogous to Wilson's plover being the crab crunching bird that he is compared to his smaller buddies, the semi-palmated and piping plovers. We may or may not see these out there on the mud flats. They are around. I don't know if they spend the whole winter out there. Some places they will, some places they won't. But that's a species we'll definitely be keeping an eye out for on Saturday. If we do get to see them, we'll point them out. And then that's a female there, I believe. It's pretty big, but it's not quite as thick, but very long bill on it there. Another one that has a variable amount of band on it. This one's the females are a little bit more duller brown, not quite as much black on them as the males. Some of the males can be downright white, actually, especially in breeding condition. It's really kind of interesting. But we hopefully will see Wilson's plover out there. That's another one that's very strictly coastal. You rarely ever get Wilson's popping up in inland areas. And then these are the non-banded type plovers, the black-bellied plover here, which is The British actually call these gray plovers, which in winter plumage, that's a much better name for them. They don't have the big black belly, but they got huge black eye on them, big round body. They're much bigger than the smaller banded plovers are, and a fairly stout, again, stubby, blunt bill on it, typical of plovers. I don't have any flight shots. I was hoping I did. When they fly, they have a big black patch on the inside of the wing there. The American golden plover in winter plumage can look very similar to this, usually a little bit more browner with a little more defined stripe above the eye and a smaller bill. But American golden plover lacks the black wing pits and the white rump that a black-bellied plover has. So if we see those out there, there's a decent chance we'll get those on Saturday out there. And if they fly, you can take a look. You'll see that little patch underneath the wing, and you'll see the white rump probably. If you see one that doesn't have that, then that's probably a golden plover, which golden plovers are migrating through right now. They typically migrate up through Texas and in the central flyway in the springtime. We see them more in the fall if we see them at all. In the fall, they actually migrate offshore quite a bit. So they're one of those birds that might show up after a storm, after a hurricane goes up in the Gulf Stream. It might swing some golden plovers our way or Hudsonian godwits or other things that tend to migrate offshore. They might get crosswinds, blow them over to the shorelines. Actually, I saw a golden plover when I was working at Fort Pierce Inlet State Park. We were getting ready to shut down the park for the hurricane. It was in September. And I had this thought. I was like, well, it's September. There's a hurricane sitting out there. There's golden plovers migrating. you know, maybe I should go, check the beach one last time before we shut down here. And I walked out to the beach on the fourth boardwalk, and there's a golden plover standing on the beach there. Still the only one I've seen in St. Lucie County, actually. So it was pretty cool. I got a lot of good county birds when I was working at Fort Pierce Inlet State Park. So still haven't made 300 in that county yet, but I'm at 276 now. But anyway, so I could do a whole other talk on county listings sometime if you guys want, but I'll stick to Ponce Inlet birds for now. Hopefully, I'm going to wrap it up pretty soon, I hope, so I can give you time for questions here. This is why they call them black-bellied plovers. They have that black belly. I don't have any good pictures. Surprisingly, I don't have any good pictures of breeding plumage, but they have that. They're more white on the back, the solid black belly. Same structure and all that, but very different plumage. And then red knots, I just wanted to include this because we do sometimes we don't see them when they're red very often, but they're a sandpiper, but they're almost plover-like. They're kind of chunky. They have a small eye like a sandpiper. The bill is a little bit more blunt. A decent chance we might see some of these out here. They kind of look like a mashup of a sandpiper and a black-bellied plover, actually. Very dull gray overall. Really not a whole lot to them. A little bit of an eye stripe above the eye, but they're kind of just a plain kind of like a shorebird starter kit there. This is what you start with when you want to paint all the different markings on to make your shorebird out of. Kind of like the orange-crowned warbler in the warbler world. They just don't have much for field marks. You start with orange crown and then you paint on your wing bars and your eye stripes and you make up your other warblers from them. This is the orange crowned warbler of the shorebird world, at least in the wintertime. Now in the summer they're very red. Very interesting, kind of a brick red color, but and this one's a lot paler individually. See, he's hanging out with some ruddy turnstones along the. This was at Boynton Inlet actually. And again, kind of chunky, but a little bit of a sandpiper-like bill on him, but kind of chunky-ish, like a little bit plover-ish. This one's kind of a paler individual, not quite as gray underneath as a lot of them are. The other thing I did, I didn't twist this photo. This is actually at an angle at Ponce Inlet, in the inlet, not Ponce Inlet, at Boynton Inlet. The inlet itself just has these angled concrete walls on the sides there, and they get covered in algae and stuff as the tide comes up and down. And so these red knots are feeding on that algae on there. It's kind of a odd little habitat. Usually you find them on mud flats and beaches and stuff like that. So we may see red knots. They are out there in the Ponce Inlet area. Hopefully we get to see some out there in the mud flats out there. We'll see. But we'll definitely point them out if we were able to see them out there. So I think that was, oh, I have a blank in there. How about that? So, okay. So that was the last one. We've got some time for questions out there. I think you got the contact information is on the meetup as well. We just got confirmation that we're doing Guatemala next February. So if you guys want to come down and see pink-headed warblers, we can sign you up now for that through Holbrook Travel. So um, we're going to try and do a trip to Trinidad and Tobago, but I think that's going to get postponed until 2026 in August. But the time that we're going down there is when the leatherback sea turtles are nesting down there. So it'd be a good time to go see that. I've seen leatherback turtles off the coast of Florida, but I've not seen them nesting before. So I'm hoping to get that trip going. So yeah, I think that's it for me talking. Now I can ask questions, or you guys can ask questions if you want from this point.
That's great, David. And I'm gonna, if anybody, this is Liz, if anybody wants to ask questions, if you can go into the chat group, do you have access to the chat? And you can see if people are asking questions, David, or
Hold on. Let me get
I
out
can
of
look at it
sharing.
too.
Yeah, let me get out of sharing the screen so I can go back to the normal. Um, there we go. Okay, where's the chat? Oh, there we go. We got a few questions in the chat, I think there. So unable to hear.
Oh, I think that got resolved. So,
Okay. Not seeing the video. Well, we don't have any video going, so yeah. So okay. So all right. Okay.
oh,
No questions then. Okay. Yeah.
Tammy's asking, should we bring a scope on Saturday?
Yes, spring scopes if you guys have them. More the merrier as far as scope. I'll have mine, but we'll have a bunch of people there. So if we have more scopes, we can put it on, either put more scopes on the same bird or we can get scopes on different birds out there. So definitely bring scopes if you've got them. It'll be a much better experience for you if you do. And if you don't have them, we're all friends. We'll share with you guys too. So um,
Okay. And thanks, Paula. Thanks for joining us. Looking forward to seeing you on Saturday. It's going to be super fun. Um,
yeah. Ponce Inlet's a great spot. Yeah, so I think you guys are gonna enjoy it. I always do. So there's always something to see out there. So and great
great.
restaurants nearby too. So there's a
Well,
lot of
that's
good
true
eating
too.
places nearby. Yeah, so yeah, I got a few recommendations for that. I can go over on Saturday. So if you guys
Oh, good.
yeah,
Excellent.
yeah. So anyway, so yeah. So hopefully see some of you guys out there. I'm sure I'll see some of you guys out there, and it'll be a good experience. And yeah, I'll put whatever stuff we get, I'll put together a photo album and share it with the group. So even if you're not there, you'll get a chance to see some of the stuff that we saw while we were out there.
Okay,
Make
that's
yeah,
awesome. Yeah. And if you're
yeah.
gonna one of us will do a checklist. I mean, maybe since you're leading, you might not want to have to do the checklist, but you're
I've
probably gonna
gotten
be better
I've
at
gotten
doing
pretty
it.
good at yeah, I've gotten pretty good at doing the eBird app is so easy to use now that it's actually and I use it constantly. So I've gotten pretty good at guiding and keeping an eBird list at the same time. So
Aw-
that's not a problem, I don't think. So
Awesome. I do have one other question. Is there a chance we
uh-huh.
might see some seabirds? I don't know. I don't know what could be there, but is there a
Gannett,
chance?
Gannets will probably be around.
Okay.
They're still moving north. Some of them have already left us, but around inlets like that, the gannets follow the fish, so it's a matter of whether the bait fish are around there or not. But we will scan a bit offshore when we're up there on the jetty. Gannets are the most likely thing. Parasitic Jaegers often feed fairly close to shore in Volusia County, so we may happen to catch a Jaeger out there or something like that too. Depends on where the shrimp boats are, the other boats and stuff are. So there is a possibility. Most likely, gannets would be the main thing we might see out there. There's not a whole lot of like shearwaters and storm petrels and stuff like that around right now. And most of that stuff wouldn't come in unless there's a big storm. Anyways, but yeah, we might see a few things out there. We may even see some ducks moving north, maybe some scoters and other stuff like that. A lot of ducks have left us now, but other ducks might be coming through. Teal and whatever else might come flying by offshore. So we'll definitely keep an eye out offshore for stuff like that. So,
Okay. Well, I don't see any more questions. Thanks for joining us, Michelle, and thanks
yep.
Celia for joining us, and Paula, of course, and Maggie, everybody. And I am going to go ahead and figure out if I can stop the recording here.
Okay.